May I have the honor of this dance, Miss Clara?
Forgive me, Your Grace, I must decline.
The ballroom went silent. 400 guests, 4 orchestras, 14 months of planning, and the most desirable man in England was standing in front of her with his hand extended. The Duke of Ashford had never been refused anything in his life, not by women who would have killed for his attention, not by society that had crowned him its golden prince, not by anyone, ever, for any reason. And Clara Hartwell, plain, poor, and ruined by scandal, looked at his hand as if it were a snake. The Duke smiled, that perfect, effortless smile that had charmed duchesses and disarmed rivals and never, not once, failed to get him what he wanted. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice carrying across the stunned silence, "will you honor me with this dance?" And Clara, who had nothing left to lose, who had buried her father in disgrace and survived 3 years on the edges of the society that destroyed him, looked the most powerful man in England in the eye and said the one word no one had ever said to him before: "No." Before I tell you why she refused him, I need to ask you something. Where in the world are you watching this from? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you haven't subscribed to Jane Tells Stories yet, do it now. This story is going to show you what real power looks like. If you don't subscribe, you owe me a favor. Now, let me take you back 3 years, to a scandal that destroyed everything Clara Hartwell had ever known, and a refusal that would change both their lives forever. The Bramcote Ball was the event of the 1817 season before it even began. Lady Letitia Bramcote had spent 14 months planning it, longer than some women spent preparing for their weddings. She had commissioned a new ballroom from the architect John Nash, a confection of gilt and mirrors and crystal chandeliers that could hold 400 guests. She had ordered white soup from Gunter's, ices from Negri's, and champagne by the crate from the Duke of Wellington's own supplier. She had hired 4 orchestras, stationed them in the 4 corners of the room so that no matter where one stood, the music would surround you like a warm bath. She had done all of this for one reason: the Duke of Ashford was coming. Sebastian Fitzroy, Duke of Ashford, was 33 years old, unmarried, and universally acknowledged as the most desirable man in England. He was tall, dark-haired, chuck with the kind of face that made women stop mid-sentence and men check their cravats. He was wealthy, not merely dukely wealthy, but invested in canals and railways and the new manufactories of the north, so that his fortune grew even as he slept. He was charming, not the desperate charm of a man who needs to be liked, but the effortless charm of a man who has never been disliked in his life. He was also, though few people recognized it, profoundly lonely. He had been lonely for so long that he had forgotten the feeling had a name. He moved through the world, collecting admiration the way other men collected stamps, methodically, automatically, without genuine interest in the individual specimens. He danced with women because it was expected. He smiled at hostesses because it cost him nothing. He accepted invitations, proposed toasts, made the rounds of Almack's and Devonshire House, and every great estate in between, performing the role of the Golden Duke with a perfection that had become indistinguishable from emptiness. He had never been refused anything in his life. Not by his father, who had died when Sebastian was 18 and left him a dukedom he did not want. Not by his mother, who had died when he was 10 and left him with memories of warmth that had faded to the point of unreliability. Not by the women who pursued him, the men who envied him, the society that had crowned him its king before he was old enough to understand what crowns cost. He had never been refused a dance. Until Clara Hartwell. Clara Hartwell was 24 years old, plain, poor, and possessed of an integrity that had become, over the course of her short life, to more burden than virtue. She was the daughter of Edmund Hartwell, once the most celebrated music master in London, a man who had taught the children of dukes and duchesses, who had played for the Prince Regent himself, who had been offered positions at the Royal Academy and the Chapel Royal, and had refused them all to maintain his independence. Edmund Hartwell had believed that music was a sacred trust, that a teacher's duty was to his art and his students rather than his patrons. That integrity was worth more than security. He had died in disgrace, and Clara had inherited both his integrity and his ruin. The scandal had broken 3 years ago. A Haydn manuscript, previously unknown, had surfaced in Edmund Hartwell's possession, a set of variations on a theme, authenticated by 3 experts, are purchased by the noble collector Lord Pemberton for £12,000. The manuscript had been a forgery. The experts had been deceived. Lord Pemberton, discovering the fraud, had demanded prosecution. Edmund Hartwell had maintained his innocence until his death. He had produced no evidence of it. The forger was never found. The experts recanted. The music world, which had celebrated Hartwell as a genius, turned on him with the savagery of the betrayed. He died 6 months after the accusation, not in prison, for the case never came to trial, but in his small Bloomsbury house, of a heart that could not bear the weight of shame. Clara had been 21. She had been engaged to a promising young barrister named Henry Blackwell, no relation, merely a coincidence of names that had once seemed romantic, and he had broken the engagement within a week of the scandal. She had not blamed him. She had blamed no one, not even the unknown forger who had destroyed her father's life. She had simply done what needed to be done. She had sold the house, not the Bloomsbury house, which was rented, but the small country property her mother had left her. She had used the proceeds to pay her father's debts, to settle with Lord Pemberton, to ensure that her younger brother Henry could continue his studies at the Royal Academy of Music. She had taken employment as a music teacher, giving lessons to the daughters of the ton, surviving on the margins of the society that had destroyed her father. She had survived. She had not thrived. She had made herself small, useful, forgettable, the kind of woman who enters through service entrances, who waits in back parlours, who speaks only when spoken to, and then with careful neutrality. She had performed the role of the impoverished gentlewoman with the same mechanical perfection that the Duke of Ashford performed his, and she had hated every moment of it. But she had survived. Mrs. Albertine Foskett had been Edmund Hartwell's patron for 20 years. She was a wealthy widow of 60, with iron grey hair, sharp black eyes, and a spine that had refused to bend since her husband's death in 1795. She had loved Edmund Hartwell, not romantically, but as one loves a true artist, with a devotion that transcended the personal. She had attended his concerts, commissioned his compositions, defended his reputation when others wavered. She had been one of the few people who believed in his innocence, who had written letters of protest to the papers, who had cut Lord Pemberton dead at a reception and never spoken to him again. She had also, for 3 years, been trying to restore Clara's position in society. "You are your father's daughter," Mrs. Foskett had said, repeatedly, over tea in her drawing room. "Your talent is his talent. Your character is his character. You have nothing to be ashamed of, and I will not permit you to hide yourself away like a criminal." "I am not hiding," Clara had replied, repeatedly. "I am surviving. There is a difference. Surviving is what animals do. You are a Hartwell. You will do more than survive." Mrs. Foskett had secured the invitation to the Bramcote ball through her own considerable social capital. She had known Lady Letitia Bramcote's mother, had attended her wedding, had sent a silver christening cup when Letitia was born. The connection was tenuous, stretched thin by years and scandal, but it held. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, written in Lady Letitia's elegant hand, requesting the pleasure of Miss Clara Hartwell's company at the ball of the season. Clara had stared at it for a long time. She knew what it was. It was not a gesture of reconciliation. It was not an acknowledgement of her father's innocence. It was a trap, a social trap designed to display her humiliation, to remind the world of her fallen state, to provide entertainment for the bored and cruel. Lady Letitia Bramcote had never forgiven Clara's father for rejecting her. Not as a student, she had been an indifferent musician at best, but as a woman. She had wanted him, in some vague, entitled way, and he had treated her with the same professional courtesy he extended to everyone, which, for Lady Letitia, was the ultimate insult. She had been 17 then. She was 28 now, and she had waited 11 years for her revenge. Clara knew all of this. Mrs. Foskett knew it too, though she pretended otherwise. "It is an opportunity," Mrs. Foskett had said, "to show them that you are not defeated, to reclaim your place." "My place is in a music room, teaching scales to bored heiresses," Clara had replied. "Not in a ballroom, performing dignity for people who have none." "Then perform it for me." That was the argument that won. Clara owed Mrs. Foskett everything: her introduction to her first pupils, her defence when others attacked, her unwavering belief in Edmund Hartwell's innocence. She could not refuse this request, however misguided, however dangerous. She had accepted the invitation. The dress was her mother's. It had been made in 1805, when empire waists were higher and sleeves shorter, when the fashion was for classical simplicity rather than the elaborate ornamentation of the current decade. It was white muslin, embroidered with forget-me-nots in pale blue silk, high-waisted, short-sleeved, utterly out of date. Clara had altered it as best she could. She had lowered the waistline, added a lace fichu to cover the décolletage that was no longer fashionable, let out the seams where her figure differed from her mother's. It was still, unmistakably, an old dress. It was still, unmistakably, the best she could do. She looked at herself in the small mirror above her dressing table. A plain face, not ugly, not beautiful, but plain. Brown hair that refused to hold a curl. Grey eyes that were her father's, with his same intensity, his same capacity for seeing too much. A mouth that she kept carefully neutral, because smiles invited familiarity and frowns invited concern, and she wanted neither. She was 24 years old, and she felt 40. Her brother Henry was at the academy, practicing his violin. He did not know about the ball. He did not know about the invitation, the dress, the risk his sister was taking. Clara had kept it from him because she knew what he would say, that she should not go, that she owed these people nothing, that her father's memory deserved better than her performance of dignity for his destroyers. He was right, but she was going anyway. She pinned her hair simply, gathered at the nape of her neck with a ribbon that matched the forget-me-nots. She put on her mother's dress. She wrapped herself in her plain grey cloak, the cloak of a music teacher, not a guest, and walked out into the evening. Mrs. Foskett's carriage was waiting. Grosvenor Square was a blaze of light. Every window of the Bramcote house glowed with candle flame. Carriages lined the street. Crested carriages, private carriages, hired carriages, all jostling for position at the entrance. Footmen in livery hurried up and down the steps, assisting ladies in silk and diamonds, gentlemen in knee breeches and orders. The orchestra could be heard from the street, a waltz already in progress, the music spilling out into the night like an invitation. Clara descended from Mrs. Foskett's carriage and stood for a moment on the pavement, looking up at the house. It was beautiful. It was also, she knew, a stage set, a carefully constructed illusion of warmth and welcome that concealed the cold machinery of power beneath. "Come, my dear," Mrs. Foskett said, taking her arm. "Chin up, shoulders back. Remember who you are." "I am a music teacher with no fortune and a ruined reputation," Clara said quietly. "I remember perfectly." "You are a Hartwell," Mrs. Foskett corrected, with a ferocity that made Clara smile despite herself. "And that is more than anyone in that house can claim." They climbed the steps. They entered the hall. They surrendered their cloaks to a footman and proceeded toward the ballroom. The heat hit Clara first. The warmth of 200 bodies, 400 candles, the accumulated breath of a room full of people trying too hard to enjoy themselves. Then the sound, the orchestra, the chatter, the clink of glasses, the rustle of silk. Then the smell, perfume, pomade, the faint underlying sweetness of melting ice. The ballroom was everything Lady Letitia had promised. The mirrors multiplied the candlelight into infinity. The chandeliers dripped crystal. The walls were hung with silk, the colour of ripe peaches, and the floor was polished to such a shine that it reflected the dancers like a dark lake. And the dancers, Clara had forgotten, in her years of exile, what the London season looked like in full cry. The women in their white and pastels, the men in their black and gold, the whirl of colour and movement that was beautiful and terrible and utterly artificial. She saw debutantes with flowers in their hair, their faces fixed in expressions of desperate hope. She saw chaperones on gilt chairs, their eyes darting like hawks. She saw men calculating, women manoeuvring, everyone performing the elaborate choreography of the marriage market. She saw the Duke of Ashford. He was standing near the centre of the room, surrounded by a circle of admirers, men seeking his favour, women seeking his notice, hostesses seeking his attendance at their own events. He was smiling, that famous smile, warm and distant and utterly meaningless. He was listening to a young woman in pink silk who was speaking with the breathless enthusiasm of someone who has rehearsed this conversation for days. He looked, Clara thought, like a man who had forgotten how to be alone. "There is Lady Letitia," Mrs. Foskett murmured. "I must pay my respects. Will you be all right?" "I will be fine," Clara said. "Go." Mrs. Foskett moved toward their hostess, leaving Clara at the edge of the room. She found a chair against the wall, not quite among the wallflowers, but close enough to observe them. She watched the dancers, the flirtations, the careful negotiations of rank and desire. She thought of her father, who had hated these events, who had attended only when absolutely necessary, and had always retreated to the music room to play when the conversation became unbearable. She thought of Henry, practicing his violin in a cold academy practice room, unaware that his sister was sitting in the house of his father's destroyer, wearing their mother's dress, pretending to be something she was not. She thought, "I should not have come." And then the master of ceremonies was before her, bowing, and behind him stood the Duke of Ashford. "Miss Hartwell," the master of ceremonies said, "may I present his grace, the Duke of Ashford? Your grace, Miss Clara Hartwell." Clara rose. She curtsied, a slight, correct movement that cost her nothing. She looked up at the Duke and waited. He was taller than she expected. His eyes were grey-green, with a small scar bisecting his left eyebrow. A childhood accident, she remembered reading somewhere. His hair was dark and slightly too long, curling at his collar in a way that suggested either carelessness or a deliberate affectation of informality. His smile was perfect, and his eyes were empty, not cruel, not unkind, simply empty, like rooms that had been cleared of furniture, like theatres after the performance has ended. He was looking at her, but he was not seeing her, and he was seeing a woman in an unfashionable dress, a woman of no importance, a woman who would be grateful for his attention because all women were grateful for his attention. "Miss Hartwell," he said. His voice was warm, melodious, trained by years of social performance. "I do not believe we have met." "We have not, Your Grace." "Then I am delighted to make your acquaintance. Will you do me the honour of the next dance?" The question was automatic. She could see that. He had asked it 100 times tonight, would ask it 100 more before the evening ended. It was not an invitation. It was a ritual, a social obligation, a performance of democratic charm that cost him nothing and gained him everything. She looked at his hand, extended toward her. She looked at his face, still smiling, still empty. She looked at the room around them, the watching eyes, the held breath, the expectation that she would blush, stammer, accept with grateful tears. She thought of her father, dying in disgrace while these people laughed. She thought of her brother, practicing his violin in a cold room. She thought of herself, sitting in back parlours for 3 years, making herself small, making herself useful, making herself invisible so that she could survive. "No, Your Grace," she said. "I do not wish to dance." The silence was absolute. It began at the centre of the room, where they stood, and radiated outward like a stone dropped in still water. The orchestra, as if sensing something, faltered and stopped. The chatter died. The clink of glasses ceased. 200 people turned to look at the woman who had refused the Duke of Ashford. Clara saw his smile falter. Just for a moment. Just the slightest crack in the perfect mask. She saw confusion in his eyes. Genuine confusion. The confusion of a man who has encountered a fact that does not fit his understanding of the world. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I do not wish to dance," Clara repeated. Her voice was steady. She had not raised it, had not added emphasis, had not made a scene. She had simply stated a fact, as she might state that it was raining or that the room was warm. "With you, or with anyone, I am not here to perform for your amusement, Your Grace. I am here because I was invited. That is all." She turned. She walked to the wall, where the wallflowers sat, the unpartnered, the unwanted, the invisible. She sat among them. She folded her hands in her lap. She did not look back. The silence held for 1 heartbeat. 2. 3. Then the whispers began. The Duke of Ashford stood motionless in the centre of the ballroom and felt something he had not felt in 15 years. He did not know what it was. He knew only that it was not anger, though anger came later. It was not embarrassment, though embarrassment was certainly present. It was something deeper, something that felt like a door opening in a room he had believed was solid wall. He looked at Clara Hartwell, sitting against the wall with perfect composure. She was not looking at him. She was not looking at anyone. She was simply sitting, her hands folded, her face calm, as if she had not just committed the social equivalent of regicide. He became aware, slowly, that the room was waiting for him. 200 people were watching, breathless, to see how he would respond. Would he laugh it off? Would he demand an apology? Would he cut her dead, ruin her, destroy her with a word? He should do one of these things. He knew he should. A duke did not tolerate refusal. A duke did not permit insolence from a music teacher's daughter. A duke maintained his dignity, his authority, his invincibility. But he could not move. He was staring at Clara Hartwell, and he was seeing her, really seeing her, for the first time. He saw the plain dress, the simple hair, the face that was not beautiful by any conventional standard. He saw the calm that was not composure, but something deeper, something earned. He saw a woman who had looked at him, at the Golden Duke, at the most desirable man in England, and had found him wanting, not wanting as a lover, wanting as a human being. She had seen through him. She had seen the emptiness behind the smile, the performance behind the charm, the loneliness that he had buried so deep he had forgotten it existed, and she had refused to participate in the theatre that sustained it. "Your Grace!" Lady Letitia Bramcote was at his elbow, her voice sharp with anxiety. "I apologize for Miss Hartwell's behaviour. She is not quite. I will have her removed immediately." "No," he said. "Your Grace?" He turned to look at his cousin. He saw her beautiful face, her calculating eyes, her desperation to control the narrative of this evening. He saw, with sudden clarity, that she had invited Clara Hartwell not as a gesture of reconciliation, but as entertainment. A ruined woman to be displayed, mocked, destroyed, for the amusement of the ton. He saw that he had been part of this plan, however unwittingly. He had been the bait, the prize, the mechanism by which Clara Hartwell would be humiliated. His automatic charm, his democratic dancing, his meaningless smile, all of it had been weaponized against a woman who had done nothing but exist with integrity. He felt sick. "The ball is concluded," he said. His voice carried across the silent room, not loud, but clear, with the authority of a man who has never been disobeyed. The silence deepened. The guests stared at him in disbelief. "Your Grace!" Lady Letitia gasped. "You cannot—" "The supper, the dancing, is concluded," he repeated. "My apologies to our hostess. Good evening." He turned and walked toward the door. He did not look at Clara Hartwell. He could not look at her. Not yet. Not while the room was watching. Not while his own emotions were still raw and unexamined. He walked out of the ballroom, out of the house, into the cool night air. He did not stop. He did not look back. He walked through Grosvenor Square, past the line of carriages, past the curious footmen, past the boundary of his own understanding of himself. Behind him, the Bramcote ball dissolved into chaos. Clara sat against the wall and watched the Duke of Ashford walk out of the room. She had not expected this. She had expected— what? That he would laugh, turn to the next woman, forget her by morning? That he would be angry, demand an apology, have her removed, as Lady Letitia suggested? That he would do any of the 1,000 things a powerful man did when refused by a powerless woman? She had not expected him to cancel the ball. The room was in uproar. Lady Letitia was weeping, or pretending to weep, surrounded by a circle of concerned guests. The orchestra had stopped playing entirely. The white soup was cooling in the supper room, the ices melting, the champagne going flat. 200 people who had come to be seen, to dance, to advance their social fortunes, were instead standing in clusters, whispering, speculating, assigning blame. And all of it, was being laid at Clara's feet. "How dare she?" she heard someone say. "A music teacher's daughter. Did you see her dress? Her mother's, I am told, out of date by 12 years. She has ruined the evening. Ruined it. The Duke was only being kind, only being democratic, and she— Clara listened to the whispers without expression. She had expected this too. She had known, when she said no, that she was sentencing herself to social death. A woman who refused one partner without excuse was bound by the iron law of ballroom etiquette. She could not dance with anyone else that evening. She had publicly declared herself unavailable, uncooperative, ungovernable. She had made herself a wallflower by choice, and the Tun would never forgive her for the insult. She did not care. Or rather, she cared too much about the wrong things to care about this one. She cared about her father's memory. She cared about her brother's future. She cared about her own integrity, the last thing she had left, the only thing no one could take from her. Mrs. Foskett found her, white-faced, trembling with a mixture of pride and terror. "Clara," she whispered, "my dear, what have you done?" "What I had to do," Clara said. She rose, smoothing her mother's dress. "I think we should leave, Mrs. Foskett, before they remember that I am still here." They collected their cloaks. They walked down the steps, past the line of carriages, past the footman who looked at them with undisguised curiosity. They climbed into Mrs. Foskett's carriage and rode away from Grosvenor Square, away from the ruin of the Bramcote ball, away from the scandal that would be all over London by morning. Clara did not look back. She did not know then that the Duke of Ashford was standing in the shadows of a nearby doorway, watching her carriage depart. She did not know that he had walked back to the square after leaving the ball, unable to go home, unable to forget her face. She did not know that he stood there in the darkness, watching the only woman who had ever refused him disappear into the night, and felt something that might have been the beginning of hope. The scandal broke with the dawn. By 7 o'clock, the story was in the morning papers. Not the details, for no journalist had been present, but the broad strokes. The Duke of Ashford had been refused a dance. The Duke of Ashford had cancelled the Bramcote ball. A woman named Hartwell, some connection to a disgraced music master, was somehow involved. By noon, the version had shifted. It was no longer the Duke who had cancelled the ball. It was Miss Hartwell who had forced his hand by her insolence, her rudeness, her unforgivable breach of etiquette. She had insulted the Duke. She had ruined Lady Letitia's ball. She had destroyed the evening for 200 innocent guests. By 3 o'clock, Clara had lost her first pupil. The letter arrived by footman, polite, regretful, citing changed circumstances. The mother of Miss Emily Carruthers, who had been studying piano with Clara for 2 years, had decided that her daughter's education would be better served by a teacher with unblemished connections. By 5 o'clock, she had lost 2 more. By evening, the third. She sat in her small Bloomsbury parlour, the room where she taught, where her father's piano still stood like a black monument, and read the letters with a calm that surprised her. She had expected this. She had prepared for this. And yet the reality of it, the finality, the swiftness, the absolute erasure of her livelihood, was more brutal than she had imagined. She had 6 pupils remaining. By morning, she would have fewer. Henry came home at 8, carrying his violin case, his face glowing with the satisfaction of a good practice session. He was 16, tall for his age, with their father's sensitive hands and their mother's dark eyes. He did not know about the ball. He did not know about the scandal. "Clara," he said, dropping his case and moving to the piano. "Listen. I have nearly mastered the cadenza. The one you said was impossible." "Henry." Something in her voice stopped him. He turned, really looked at her, and saw the letters on the table, the grey exhaustion in her face. "What happened?" she told him. Not all of it. Not the Duke's cancelled ball, not the whispers, not the full weight of her social destruction. But the essential facts. She had attended a ball. She had been indiscreet. She had lost pupils. They would need to be careful with money for a while. Henry listened with the gravity of a boy who had been forced to become a man too young. "It was the Bramcote ball," he said slowly. "Lady Letitia Bramcote." "Yes. Clara. She is the one who—" He stopped, his hands clenched at his sides. "She destroyed father. She planted that manuscript. Everyone knows it. Everyone knows, and no one says—" "We do not know that," Clara said quietly. "We suspect. We do not know." "I know," Henry said fiercely. "I have known since I was 13. And you went to her ball? You let her. I went for Mrs. Foskett. I went because I owed her. And I do not regret what I did, Henry. I will never regret it." "What did you do?" She told him. The refusal. The Duke's reaction. The cancelled ball. Henry stared at her. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. The first genuine smile she had seen from him in months. "You refused the Duke of Ashford?" "I did." "And he cancelled the ball?" "He did." Henry laughed, a short, startled sound, like a bird breaking into song. "Clara. Clara, that is magnificent. That is—" He stopped, his smile fading. "That is also your ruin." "Yes," she said. "It is." They sat in silence for a long moment. The fire crackled in the grate. Outside, London went about its business. Carriages rattling, vendors calling, the endless noise of a city that did not care about the destruction of a music teacher's livelihood. "I will leave the academy," Henry said finally. "No." "Clara, I can work. I can teach. I can—" "You will not leave the academy." Her voice was sharp, final. "You will finish your studies. You will become the musician father believed you could be. That is not negotiable, Henry. That is the only thing that matters." "And you? What about you?" "I will find other pupils, or other work. I am not without skills." "In London? After this scandal?" "Then not in London." She said it calmly, as if she had already decided. "There are other cities, other countries perhaps. I speak French. I could teach in Paris, in Geneva, in—" "Clara!" Henry's voice cracked. "You cannot leave?" "I can do whatever is necessary." She rose, moved to the piano, ran her fingers over the keys without pressing them. "I have always done what is necessary. You know that." Henry was silent. Then, "The Duke? What does he want?" "I do not know. I do not care. He is nothing to me." But even as she said it, she knew it was not entirely true. The Duke of Ashford was not nothing. He was the man who had looked at her, after her refusal, with something other than anger or contempt. He was the man who had cancelled a ball, an act of social violence that made no sense, that served no purpose, that had destroyed his own reputation along with hers. He was a mystery, and Clara Hartwell, despite herself, had never been able to resist a mystery. The Duke of Ashford did not sleep. He sat in his library at Ashford House, the great mansion in Mayfair that he had inherited at 18 and had never learned to love, and stared at the fire. He had sent his valet away. He had refused supper. He had sat in the dark for refused supper. He had sat in the dark for hours, watching the flames, trying to understand what had happened to him in the Bramcote ballroom. He had been refused. The words were simple. The fact was not. For 15 years, since his father's death, since his inheritance of the dukedom, since his emergence into society as the most eligible man in England, he had never been refused anything. Women had pursued him. Men had courted him. Hostesses had designed their events around his convenience. He had become so accustomed to acquiescence that he had stopped noticing it, the way one stops noticing the air one breathes. And then, Clara Hartwell had looked at him with grey eyes that saw too much and had said no. Not petulantly, not rudely, not even with the calculated refusal that some women employed to heighten their desirability. She had said no with absolute calm, with perfect sincerity, with the simple statement that she was not there to perform for his amusement. She had seen him. She had seen through him, and she had found him wanting. The fire crackled. The Duke poured himself a brandy he did not drink. He thought about Clara Hartwell, what he knew of her, which was almost nothing, and what he felt about her, which he did not understand. He knew her name. He knew her father's scandal. He knew from the whispers that had reached him even in his isolation that she was a music teacher, that she supported a younger brother, that she had been engaged and broken, that she lived on the margins of the society that had destroyed her father. He knew that Lady Letitia had invited her to the ball as entertainment, as a specimen of ruin to be displayed for the amusement of the ton. He knew that he had been part of this plan, however unwittingly. His automatic charm, his democratic dancing, his meaningless smile, all of it had been weaponized against a woman who had done nothing but maintain her integrity in a world that punished integrity. He thought about her face. Plain, calm, utterly without the performance that every other woman in that room had engaged in. She had not tried to attract him. She had not tried to repel him. She had simply refused to participate in the theatre of which he was the star, and he had cancelled the ball. Why? He still did not know. He had acted on instinct, an instinct so buried, so atrophied, that he had not recognized it until afterward. He had seen Lady Letitia's plan, seen his own complicity, seen the cruelty of the world he moved through with such effortless privilege. And he had reacted with an anger that was not directed at Clara Hartwell, but at everything she had refused. And he had cancelled the ball because he could not bear to continue performing in a theatre where she would not perform with him. The realization sat in his chest like a stone. He was 33 years old, a duke, wealthy, powerful, admired, and he had just destroyed his social standing, not for love, not even for desire, but for the simple, devastating recognition that a woman he did not know had seen him more clearly than anyone ever had. He needed to understand her. He needed to understand himself, and he could not do either from the isolation of Ashford House. He rang for his secretary. He gave orders. He would investigate Clara Hartwell, not as an adversary, not as a conquest, but as a puzzle that he needed to solve. He would learn her history, her circumstances, her reasons, and he would learn what she had seen when she looked at him, and why it had made her say no. And then he would find her, and he would ask his question. Why? The Duke's investigation took 3 days. He did not employ servants for this. He did not use his usual channels of information, the secretaries, the man of business, the network of social spies that every great house maintained. He went himself, in plain clothes, in a hired carriage, to the places where Clara Hartwell's life had unfolded. He visited the Royal Academy of Music. He spoke to Henry Hartwell's teachers, who praised the boy's talent and lamented his family's circumstances. He learned that Clara had paid her brother's fees for 3 years, that she had sold her inheritance to do so, that she had taken pupils she despised and endured humiliations she never spoke of. He visited Lord Pemberton, the collector who had purchased the forged Haydn. The old man was frail now, half blind, living in retirement in Hampstead. He spoke of Edmund Hartwell with surprising warmth. A true musician, a man of honour, whatever they said. He admitted, when pressed, that he had never been entirely convinced of Hartwell's guilt. The forgery had been too crude, too easily discovered, for a man of Hartwell's sophistication. But the experts had authenticated it, and the scandal had been too delicious to resist. "Do you know who forged it?" the Duke asked. Pemberton looked away. "I have my suspicions." "Tell me." "Lady Letitia Bramcote. She was fond of Hartwell, too fond. He rejected her, and she—" The old man sighed. "She was 17. Vindictive. She had access to her uncle's papers, his seals, his connections. It would not have been difficult for her to arrange." "And Hartwell?" "Died of shame. A good man, destroyed by a girl's vanity." Pemberton looked at the Duke with watery eyes. "Why do you ask? What interest has the Duke of Ashford in a dead music master?" "I am interested in his daughter," the Duke said. Pemberton studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he smiled. "She refused you, didn't she? At the Bramcote ball. I read about it. The whole world read about it." He laughed, a dry, rustling sound. "Good for her. Good for Clara Hartwell. She is her father's daughter." The Duke left Hampstead with more questions than answers. He had confirmed what he suspected, that Lady Letitia had destroyed Edmund Hartwell, that Clara's ruin was the result of deliberate malice, that the world he moved through was even crueler than he had imagined. He also knew, with growing certainty, that he could not let this stand. On the 4th day after the ball, the Duke of Ashford knocked on Clara Hartwell's door. It was a modest house in Bloomsbury. 3 stories, brick front, the kind of house that had once been respectable and was now slightly shabby. There was no servant to answer the door. Clara opened it herself, and her face, when she recognized him, did not change. "Your Grace," she said. "I wondered when you would come." "You wondered?" A man who cancels a ball because a woman refuses to dance with him does not simply forget. He either seeks revenge or seeks understanding. You do not strike me as vindictive." He smiled, a real smile, not the performative charm he had deployed at the Bramcote ball. "May I come in?" "I have no chaperone, no servant. It would be improper." "Then let us be improper." She studied him for a moment, those grey eyes, seeing too much, weighing too carefully. Then she stepped aside and let him enter. The parlour was small, dominated by a pianoforte that stood against the far wall like a black altar. The furniture was old, worn, carefully maintained. The air smelled of beeswax and old paper and something else. Something he could not identify, but that he later recognized as the scent of integrity, of a life lived without compromise. "Sit," Clara said, gesturing to a chair. She did not offer tea. She did not curtsy. She stood by the piano and looked at him with the same calm she had shown in the ballroom, the calm of a woman who had nothing left to lose. "You cancelled Lady Letitia's ball," she said. "That was unnecessary. You refused to dance with me. That was unprecedented. And so you came to demand an explanation? I came to ask why." She was silent for a long moment. Then she moved to the piano and sat on the bench, her fingers resting on the keys without pressing them. "Why?" she repeated. "Because you asked me to perform, and I am done performing for people who have never earned the right to watch." "I did not ask you to perform. I asked you to dance." "Dancing is performance." Every movement in that ballroom was choreographed. The smiles, the curtsies, the careful negotiations of rank and desire. You were performing. I was expected to perform with you, and I refused. "Because you do not dance." "Because I do not perform." She turned to look at him, and her grey eyes were fierce. "Do you know what it is like, Your Grace, to be invisible? To move through rooms where no one sees you? where you are merely furniture, a convenience, a background to other people's drama? I have been invisible for 3 years. I have made myself small, useful, forgettable, so that I could survive. And I will not, I will never, make myself visible for the amusement of people who destroyed my father. The Duke felt the words like a physical blow. He had expected anger, perhaps, or the defensive pride of a woman protecting her reputation. He had not expected this absolute clarity, this moral certainty, this refusal to participate in a world that had already taken everything from her. "Your father," he said carefully. "Tell me about him." She looked at him for a long moment, as if deciding whether he was worthy of the story. Then she began to play, a simple melody, a Haydn variation, the kind of music her father had taught her. She spoke over the notes, her voice steady, her fingers never faltering. "My father was a genius, not a fashionable genius, not the kind that performs for applause, but a true musician, a man who believed that music was a sacred trust. He taught the children of dukes and duchesses, but he treated them all the same, with respect, with rigor, with the understanding that talent must be earned. He refused to flatter. He refused to compromise. He refused—" Her voice caught, just slightly. He refused Lady Letitia Bramcote when she wanted more than music lessons. And she destroyed him. She planted a forged manuscript in his possession. She arranged for it to be discovered. She ensured that the experts who authenticated it were her uncle's clients, beholden to her family. And when the scandal broke, she watched with satisfaction as my father's reputation was torn to pieces. The Duke listened to the music and the story, and he felt something he had not felt in years. Rage. Not the cold, controlled anger of a man who has been inconvenienced, but the hot, human rage of someone who has witnessed injustice and cannot look away. "Why did you not fight?" he asked. "Why did you not expose her?" "With what?" Clara's fingers stilled on the keys. "I was 21. I had no money, no influence, no standing. My fiancé abandoned me. My father's friends disappeared. I had a 16-year-old brother who needed to finish his education, and I had a choice: fight a battle I could not win, or survive to protect the only person left who mattered. You chose survival. I chose Henry." She rose from the piano and faced him. "And I do not regret it. I do not regret making myself small. I do not regret teaching scales to bored heiresses. I do not regret any of it, except the moments when I almost forgot who I was, the moments when I almost began to believe that I deserved my invisibility." The Duke stood. He walked to the piano and looked at the keys, yellowed with age, worn smooth by years of playing. "I have not played since I was 12, he said. Clara looked at him, surprised by the change of subject. "Why not?" "My father died when I was 18. Before that, he taught me that a duke does not play the piano. A duke governs. A duke commands. A duke performs his duty with dignity and reserve. Music was frivolous, emotional, unbecoming." "And so you stopped?" "I stopped feeling." He turned to face her. "I stopped everything that might make me vulnerable. I learned to smile without meaning it, to charm without caring, to move through the world collecting admiration like stamps. I became the Golden Duke, and I forgot that there was ever anything else." They stood in the small parlour, the afternoon light slanting through the windows, and the Duke felt the strangest sensation, the feeling of being seen. Not admired, not desired, not flattered, but seen. Clara Hartwell looked at him with those grey eyes, and she saw not the Duke of Ashford, but Sebastian Fitzroy, a man who had stopped playing the piano at 12, who had buried his heart under 11 years of performance, who had forgotten how to be real. "Why did you cancel the ball?" she asked. "Because," he said, "I could not bear to continue performing in a theatre where you would not perform with me. You were the only real thing in that room, Miss Hartwell, and your refusal made everything else seem hollow." She was silent for a long moment. Then, "I do not want your admiration, Your Grace. I do not want your apology, your patronage, or your protection. I have survived without them, and I will continue to survive." "I know." He smiled, that real smile again, the one that transformed his face. "That is why I am here. Not to save you, to learn from you." "Learn what?" "How to be real." The Duke began visiting Clara's house every afternoon. He came in plain clothes, in a hired carriage, without servants or ceremony. He came at odd hours, sometimes at 3, sometimes at 5, once at 7 in the evening, when the light was fading, and Clara was preparing supper for Henry. He came without announcement, without expectation, without the performance that had defined his entire adult life. At first, Clara refused to teach him. She had pupils to find, a livelihood to rebuild, a reputation to salvage. She had no time for a duke's whim, for the bored curiosity of a man who would tire of her as soon as the novelty faded. "I am not here out of curiosity," he said, the third time he appeared at her door. "I am here because you are the only person I have met in 15 years who sees me, and I am desperate to understand what you see." "I see a man who has everything and wants nothing," she said. "That is not interesting, Your Grace. It is merely sad." "Then teach me to want something." She looked at him, at the exhaustion in his face, the desperation in his eyes, the vulnerability that he was showing her without armor or pretense. She thought of her father, who had believed that music could save souls. She thought of herself, who had stopped believing in salvation of any kind. "One lesson," she said. "1 hour. If you are serious, you will return tomorrow. If you are not, you will not. And we will both be relieved." He returned the next day, and the next, and the next. The lessons were not what either of them expected. See, Clara had imagined teaching a dilettante, a man who wanted to play enough to impress, who would practice enough to perform, who would tire of the discipline as soon as he had achieved a superficial competence. She had taught such men before. She had despised them. The Duke was different. He came with a seriousness that bordered on ferocity. He practiced scales until his fingers ached. He studied theory with the intensity of a scholar. He asked questions, endless, probing, sometimes naive, sometimes profound, about music, about emotion, about the connection between sound and feeling. "Why does this chord make me sad?" he asked, playing a minor progression. "Because it contains a lowered third. The interval creates tension, and tension creates emotion." "But why sadness specifically? Why not anger or fear or—" "Because you are sad," she said quietly. "The music does not create emotion. It reveals what is already there." He looked at her, and she saw the understanding dawn in his eyes, the recognition that music was not performance, but confession, not display, but discovery. He had spent 15 years performing perfection. Now he was learning to play imperfection, to let the wrong notes stand, to find beauty in the cracks. They did not touch, except when she corrected his hand position. They did not flirt, except with ideas. They built something slowly, carefully, like masons constructing a wall, one brick at a time, with no guarantee that the structure would hold. But it held. Day after day, week after week, The lessons continued. The Duke learned to play, badly at first, then adequately, and then with a rough sincerity that was more moving than any polished performance. Clara learned to teach without armor, to share her father's methods, her own insights, her deepest beliefs about music and life. And something else grew in the space between the notes, a connection, a recognition, a slow and careful building of trust. Lady Letitia Bramcote learned of the Duke's visits in the third week. She had been watching him. Of course she had been watching him. She had watched him since she was 17, since her father's music master had treated her with professional courtesy and nothing more, since she had learned that the world would not give her what she wanted and had decided to take it instead. She had invited Clara Hartwell to the ball as entertainment. She had expected the girl to be humiliated, to be mocked, to be destroyed by the contrast between her ruin and the Duke's glory. She had not expected the Duke to cancel the ball. She had not expected him to seek Clara out. She had not expected, could not have expected, that he would fall in love with the daughter of the man she had destroyed. The knowledge sat in her chest like poison. She acted with the speed of a woman who has everything to lose. She spread the story that Clara Hartwell was the Duke's mistress, that she had refused his dance as a calculated ploy, that she had seduced him with her artistic temperament, that she was using him to clear her father's name. She whispered it in drawing rooms, wrote it in letters, planted it in the ears of journalists who owed her favours. The story was more damaging than the truth, because it contained just enough plausibility to wound. A ruined woman, a lonely Duke, an unconventional relationship. The Ton loved such narratives, and they punished the participants with savage delight. Clara lost her remaining pupils within days. Mrs. Foskett wrote a letter of distress, withdrawing her support for fear of contamination. The Royal Academy of Music informed Henry that his scholarship was under review. The noose tightened. Clara received the news with the same calm she had shown in the Bramcote ballroom. She sat at her piano and played. A Beethoven sonata, the Pathétique, with a ferocity that made the room vibrate. She played until her fingers bled, until the music became a scream, until she had exhausted every emotion she had been holding back. When she finished, the Duke was standing in the doorway. He had let himself in. He had a key now, a fact that would have scandalized society if anyone had known, and he had watched her play with tears streaming down his face. "I will stop coming," he said. "If my presence destroys you, I will stop." "No." She rose from the piano, her hands shaking. "You will not stop. You will not abandon me because it is convenient. You will not—" Her voice broke. "You will not be another person who leaves when it becomes difficult." "Then what?" he asked. "What do we do?" "We fight." She wiped her hands on her dress, leaving streaks of blood on the white muslin. "I have spent 3 years making myself small. I will not do it any more. Not for Lady Letitia. Not for society. Not for anyone." "How?" She looked at him, at the man he had become, the man who practiced scales until his fingers ached, who asked questions about sadness and chords, who had learned to be real in her small parlour. "You have power," she said. "I have truth. Together, we will use both." The Duke acted with a ruthlessness that surprised even himself. He began with Lord Pemberton. The old collector, frail and half-blind, was persuaded to make a statement, a formal, sworn deposition attesting that he had never been fully convinced of Edmund Hartwell's guilt, that the forgery had been too crude for a man of Hartwell's sophistication, that he believed the true forger had never been identified. Then the Duke found the forger, a man named Silas Crane, living in poverty in Suffolk, who had been paid £50 by Lady Letitia Bramcote to create the Haydn manuscript. Crane was terrified, desperate, willing to confess everything in exchange for protection. Then the experts, the three men who had authenticated the manuscript. They admitted, under pressure, that their authentication had been hasty, influenced by Lady Letitia's family connections, possibly negligent. Then the servants, Lady Letitia's own maid, who had delivered the payment to Crane, who had heard her mistress's boasts, who had kept the secret for 11 years out of fear. The Duke gathered evidence like a general gathering troops. He wrote letters, conducted interviews, built a case that was irrefutable, and when he had everything he needed, he made it public. He wrote to the Morning Post, to the Times, to every society paper in London. He named Lady Letitia as the architect of the forgery. He cleared Edmund Hartwell's name. He destroyed his own cousin's reputation with the same ruthlessness she had once used against an innocent man. The scandal was enormous. Lady Letitia was ostracized, denounced, driven from London in disgrace. Her mother, the Duke's aunt, never spoke to him again. A dozen alliances were broken, a dozen friendships severed, a dozen careers damaged by association. The Duke did not care. For the first time in his life, he had acted from genuine conviction rather than social calculation. The freedom was intoxicating. The ceremony at the Royal Academy was small. A lecture hall, a piano, a gathering of musicians who had known Edmund Hartwell and believed in his innocence. Henry played his father's favourite piece, a Haydn concerto, the genuine article. Clara sat in the audience, watching her brother, feeling the weight of years begin to lift. The Duke sat beside her, not as her protector or her lover, but as her partner in justice. Afterward, she turned to him and said, "Thank you, but I still will not dance with you." He smiled, that real smile, the one she had learned to recognize. "I know. That is why I asked." They walked out of the academy together, into the London afternoon. The city went about its business, carriages rattling, vendors calling, the endless noise of a world that did not care about justice or truth, or the slow rebuilding of a ruined life. But Clara cared, and the Duke cared. And for the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to believe that the future might be something other than survival. 6 months later. The Duke had leased a house in the Lake District, not one of his estates, but a modest property near Ambleside, where no one knew his face. Clara lived nearby, in a cottage of her own, supporting herself by teaching music to the local gentry. Henry was at the academy, his scholarship secure, his future bright. The Duke visited her daily. They walked by the lake, through the fells, along paths where the only sound was the wind and the water and the cry of birds. They talked. About music, about politics, about the books they were reading, about the slow process of becoming real. They played piano duets, badly, joyfully, without performance or pretense. He had learned enough to accompany her, to follow her lead, to find his own voice within the music. They played Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven, the composers her father had loved. They played until the candles burned low and the fire died to embers. And they had not kissed. They had not declared themselves. They had built something slower, deeper, more durable than romance. A friendship based on mutual recognition, mutual respect, the shared experience of becoming whole. But the tension was there. Clara felt it in the way he looked at her when she played, in the way his hand brushed hers when they turned pages, in the silence that fell between them when words were no longer enough. She was afraid. She had spent her adult life refusing to perform for power, refusing to surrender her integrity for security, refusing to be what others needed her to be. And now she was in danger of wanting something she could not control. "I am not what you need," she told him one evening as they sat by the fire in her cottage. "I am plain and poor and stubborn, and you are the only person who has ever seen me," he interrupted. "Not the Duke, not the Golden Duke. Me, Sebastian, the boy who stopped playing the piano at 12 because his father told him it was unbecoming. The man who spent 15 years performing perfection because he was afraid of imperfection. You saw me, Clara. You refused me because you saw me. And that refusal was the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." "I refused you because you were arrogant," she said, but her voice was soft. "I was arrogant. I am still arrogant. But I am learning." He took her hand. "I am learning to be something else, something better, and I want to learn with you." She looked at their joined hands. She looked at the fire, at the room, at the life she had built in this small cottage. She thought of the ballroom, of the refusal, of the cancelled ball and the scandal and the long road that had led them here. "I will not be your duchess," she said. "I will not perform that role. I will not. I do not want a duchess." He raised her hand to his lips, not in the formal gesture of a courtier, but in the tender gesture of a man who has finally learned to feel. "I want you, Clara Hartwell, the woman who refused to dance, the woman who taught me to play, the woman who sees me." She looked at him, at the man he had become, the man who had learned to be real in her small parlour, who had cleared her father's name, who had chosen truth over power. She saw the boy he had been, the boy who had loved music before he learned to fear it. She saw the man he could become, the man he was becoming, with her help and her love. "I will not dance with you," she said. "Not even now. Not even—" "I know." He smiled. "I do not want you to dance. I want you to play, to teach, to be exactly who you are, with me, beside me, however you choose." She was silent for a long moment. Then slowly, she leaned forward and kissed him, not passionately, not dramatically, but with the quiet certainty of a woman who has finally found what she was looking for. "Yes," she said, "I will be with you, however I choose." They were married in the village church at Ambleside, quietly, with only the local gentry and Henry as witnesses. The Duke's family was scandalized by the modesty of the affair, by the bride's lack of fortune and connections, by the whispers that followed them into the Lake District. They did not care. They walked home from the church together, not in a carriage, but on foot, along the path by the lake where they had walked so many times before. She wore her mother's dress, the same white muslin with the forget-me-nots, altered again, still out of fashion, still perfect. They lived in the cottage at first, while the Duke's house was being renovated. Clara continued to teach. The Duke continued to learn. They played duets in the evenings, walked the fells on Sundays, built a life that was small and real and entirely their own. Eventually, they moved to the ducal estate in Yorkshire, not because they had to, but because the Duke had responsibilities he could not ignore, and because Clara believed that a man who had learned to be real could also learn to use his power for good. She became, gradually, a duchess, not the performative duchess of the London season, but something new, something real. She used her position to support musicians, to fund the Royal Academy, to advocate for the education of women. She never danced at a ball. Not once. She attended when necessary, stood at the edge of the room, watched the performance with the same calm she had shown in the Bramcote ballroom. And when young men approached her, out of curiosity, out of politeness, out of the democratic charm that their hostesses demanded, she smiled and said, "Thank you, but I do not dance." And then she would find her husband, who would be waiting for her by the door, ready to leave, ready to return to their music and their life and their quiet revolution. Because she had taught him, finally, that the greatest performance was no performance at all, that the greatest dance was the one you chose not to dance, that the greatest love was the love that saw you, truly saw you, and chose you anyway. And on winter evenings, when the fire was low and the candles burned soft, they would sit at the piano together, the Duke and Duchess of Ashford, the Golden Duke, and the woman who refused him, and play, badly, joyfully, without pretense or perfection. And in the music, they were free.